Implications interview with Henri Ronse. In a concluding note to writing and difference you stated, what remains here the displacement of a question certainly forms a system. Is this not equally true for all your books? How are they organized? Derrida, in effect they form, but indeed as a displacement and as the displacement of a question, a certain system somewhere open to an undesirable resource that sets the system in motion. The note to which you allude also recalled the necessity of those blank spaces which we know, at least since Malum, take on importance in every text. Ronse, and yet these books do not form a single book. Derrida, no. In what you call my books, what is first of all put in question is the unity of the book and the unity book considered as a perfect totality, with all the implications of such a concept. And you know that these implications concern the entirety of our culture, directly or indirectly. At the moment when such a closure demarcates itself, dare one maintain that one is the author of books, be they 1, 2, or 3. Under these titles it is solely a question of a unique and differentiated textual operation if you will, whose unfinished movement assigns itself no absolute beginning, and which, although it is entirely consumed by the reading of other texts, in a certain fashion refers only to its own writing. We must adjust to conceiving these two contradictory ideas together. Therefore it would be impossible to provide a linear, deductive representation of these works that would correspond to some logical order. Such an order is also in question, even if, I think, an entire phase or face of my texts conforms to its demands, at least by simulacrum, in order to inscribe it, in turn, into a composition that this order no longer governs. You know, in fact, that above all it is necessary to read and reread those in whose wake I write, the books in whose margins and between whose lines I mark out and read a text simultaneously almost identical and entirely other, that I would even hesitate, for obvious reasons, to call fragmentary. Ronse, but de facto, if not de jure, where is one to make the first incision into such a reading? Derrida, one can take of grammatology as a long essay articulated in two parts, whose juncture is not empirical, but theoretical, systematic, into the middle of which one could staple writing and difference. One grammatology often calls upon it. In this case the interpretation of Rousseau would also be the 12th table of the collection. Inversely, one could insert of grammatology into the middle of writing and difference, since 6 of the texts in that work preceded de facto and de jure the publication in Critique, 2 years ago, of the articles that announced of grammatology. The last 5 texts, beginning with Freud and the scene of writing, are engaged in the grammatological opening. But things cannot be reconstituted so easily, as you may well imagine. In any case, that 2 volumes are to be inscribed one in the middle of the other is due, you will agree, to a strange geometry, of which these texts are doubtless the contemporaries. Ronse, and Speech and Phenomena, to Derrida, I forgot. It is perhaps the essay which I like most. Doubtless I could have bound it as a long note to one or the other of the other 2 works. 3 of grammatology refers to it and economizes its development. But in a classical philosophical architecture, speech would come first, in it is posed, at a point which appears juridically decisive for reasons that I cannot explain here, the question of the privilege of the voice and of phonetic writing in their relationship to the entire history of the West, such as this history can be represented by the history of metaphysics, and metaphysics in its most modern, critical, and vigilant form, Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. What is meaning? What are its historical relationships to what is purportedly identified under the rubric voice as a value of presence, presence of the object, presence of meaning to consciousness, self-presence in so-called living speech and in self-consciousness? The essay which asks these questions can also be read as the other side, recto or verso, as you wish, of another essay, published in 1962, as the introduction to Husserl's The Origin of Geometry. For in this essay the problematic of writing was already in place as such, bound to the irreducible structure of deferral in its relationships to consciousness, presence, science, history and the history of science, the disappearance or delay of the origin, etc. Ronse, I asked you where to begin, and you have led me into a labyrinth. Derrida, all these texts, which are doubtless the interminable preface to another text that one day I would like to have the force to write, or still the epigraph to another that I would never have the audacity to write, are only the commentary on the sentence about a labyrinth of ciphers that is the epigraph to Speech and Phenomena. 5 Ronse, this leads to a question one cannot avoid in reading your privileged examples, Rousseau, Artaud, Bataille, Chaps. That is the question of the relationships between philosophy and non-philosophy. What is most striking from the outset is the difficulty of situating the style of your commentary. It seems to be almost impossible to define the status of your discourse. But is it necessary to try to do so? Doesn't this question itself fall within the realm of metaphysics? Derrida, I try to keep myself at the limit of philosophical discourse. I say limit and not death, for I do not at all believe in what today is so easily called the death of philosophy, nor, moreover, in the simple death of whatever the book, man, or God, especially since, as we all know, what is dead wields a very specific power. Thus, the limit on the basis of which philosophy became possible, defined itself as the episteme, functioning within a system of fundamental constraints, conceptual oppositions outside of which philosophy becomes impracticable. In my readings, I try therefore, by means of a necessarily double gesture. Ronse, you say in your Freud 6 that one writes with 2 hands. Derrida, yes, by means of this double play, marked in certain decisive places by an erasure which allows what it obliterates to be read, violently inscribing within the text that which attempted to govern it from without, I try to respect as rigorously as possible the internal, regulated play of philosophemes or epistemes by making them slide without mistreating them to the point of their impertinence, their exhaustion, their closure. To deconstruct philosophy, thus, would be to think in the most faithful, interior way the structured genealogy of philosophy's concepts, but at the same time to determine from a certain exterior that is unqualifiable or unnameable by philosophy what this history has been able to dissimulate or forbid, making itself into a history by means of this somewhere motivated repression. By means of this simultaneously faithful and violent circulation between the inside and the outside of philosophy that is of the West, there is produced a certain textual work that gives great pleasure. That is, a writing interested in itself which also enables us to read philosophemes and consequently all the texts of our culture as kinds of symptoms, a word which I suspect, of course, as I explain elsewhere, of something that could not be presented in the history of philosophy, and which, moreover, is nowhere present, since all of this concerns putting into question the major determination of the meaning of being seven as presence, the determination in which Heidegger recognized the destiny of philosophy. Now, one can follow the treatment accorded to writing as a particularly revelatory symptom, from Plato to Rousseau, Saussure, Husserl, occasionally Heidegger himself, and a fortiori in all the modern discourses, sometimes the most faithful ones that remain within Husserl's and Heidegger's questions. Such a symptom is necessarily, and structurally, dissimulated, for reasons and along pathways that I attempt to analyze. And if this symptom is revealed today, it is not at all due to some more or less ingenious discovery initiated by someone here or there. It is due rather to a certain total transformation, that can no longer even be called historical or worldwide because the transformation infringes upon the security of such significations, that also can be ascertained in other determined fields, mathematical and logical formalization, linguistics, ethnology, psychoanalysis, political economy, biology, the technology of information, programming, etc. Ronse, in your essays at least two meanings of the word writing are discernible, the accepted meaning, which opposes, phonetic, writing to the speech that it allegedly represents, but you show that there is no purely phonetic writing, and a more radical meaning that determines writing in general, before any tie to what glossomatic speak calls an expressive substance. This more radical meaning would be the common root of writing and speech. The treatment accorded to writing in the accepted sense serves as a revelatory index of the repression to which archie-writing is subject. An inevitable repression whose necessity, forms, and laws are to be investigated. This, archie-writing is linked to a chain of other names, architrace, reserve, articulation, brisure, supplement, and difference. Much has been said above about the of our difference. What does it signify? Derrida, I do not know if it signifies at all, perhaps something like the production of what metaphysics calls the sign, signified / signifier. You have noticed that this is written or read, but cannot be heard. And first off I insist upon the fact that any discourse, for example, plus, at this moment on this alteration, this graphic and grammatical aggression, implies an irreducible reference to the mute intervention of a written sign. The present participle of the verb diphthera, on which this new ft, fine del tilde, ties together a configuration of concepts I hold to be systematic and irreducible, each one of which intervenes, _tilde _tilde at a decisive moment of th tilde t, tv, wo tilde k. First, di pound f pound dot roll 1 f dot pound hey for tilde active and passive, / r / move m tilde rt. B. tj. Dot consists in deferring by means of delay, delegation, reprieve refer ida tooth, postponement, reserve e tilde. In times this sense, difference is not preceded by the non-binary and indivisible unity of a present possibility that I could reserve, like an expenditure that I would put c dot / t. Res _ tilde, l tilde on the contrary, is the very basis times on which tilde. Resonance is announced or desired in what represents it, t. ff calculatedly or for reasons of economy. Wh dot at dot tilde 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 s its sign, its trace. Ronse, from this point of view difference is an economical question. Derrida, I would even say that it is the economical concept, and since there is no 0 lj.qmy without differing, L it is the most general structure of economy, given that one understands by economy something other than the classical economy of metaphysics, or the classical metaphysics of economy. Second, the movement of diff register trademark symbol friends, as that w which produces different things, th tilde t which differ tilde enunciates, is the co-u. En route of all the 0e positional cockpit th 8 miles. Question, L tilde d tilde 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 g, such as, to take only a few examples, se tilde s dot / intelligible, intuition. Signification, nature / culture, etc. As a common root, difference is also the element of th tilde l, lo, to be distinguished from the identical, in which these oppositions are announced. Third, tilde tff dot tilde re 11 r, dot e is also th tilde productive, if it can still be put this way, off tilde s tilde 9, ff tilde r, nce dot s, of the diacriticity that the linguistics generated by Saussure, and all the structural sciences modeled upon it have recalled is the condition for any signified cation and any structure. These different, s and, for example, the taxonomical science which they may occasion are the effects of difference, they are neither inscribed in the Nevans nc, are a length brain, which does not one that they are pro tilde used. By the activity of some sp tilde k tilde in su tilde ject. Qj, j, dot, I / from this point of view, the concept of difference is / jli, dot, neither simply structuralist, nor simply geneticist ll such / q / ifo an alternative itself being an effect of difference. IJ would even say, but perhaps we will come to this later, that it is not simply a concept. Ronse, also have been struck that already in your essay on force, and signification difference, but you did not yet call it that. 12 led you back to Nietzsche, who linked the concept of force to the irreducibility of differences, and later to Freud, all of whose opposed concepts you showed to be governed by a LHE economy of difference, and finally, always, above all, to Heidegger. Derrida, yes, above all. What I have attempted to do would not have been possible without the opening of Heidegger's questions. And first, since we must proceed rapidly here, would not have been possible without the attention to what Heidegger calls the difference between being and beings, the ontico-ontological difference such as, in a way, it remains untaught by philosophy. But despite this debt to Heidegger's thought, or rather because of it, I attempt to locate in Heidegger's text which, no more than any other, is not homogeneous, continuous, everywhere equal to the greatest force and to all the consequences of its questions the signs of a belonging to metaphysics, or to what he calls ontotheology. Moreover, Heidegger recognizes that economically and strategically he had to borrow the syntactic and dialectical resources of the language of metaphysics, as one I always must do at the very moment that one deconstructs this language. Therefore we must work to locate these metaphysical holds, and to reorganize unceasingly the form and sites of our questioning. Now, among these holds, the ultimate determination of difference as the ontico-ontological difference, however necessary and decisive this phase may be, still seems to me, in a strange way, to be in the grasp of metaphysics. Perhaps then, moving along lines that would be more Nietzschean than Heideggerian, by going to the end of this thought of the truth of being, we would have to become open to a difference that is no longer determined, in the language of the West, as the difference between being and beings. Such a departure is doubtless not possible today, but one could show how it is in preparation. In Heidegger, first of all, difference fourth therefore would name provision 11 why this unfolding of difference, in particular, but not only, or first of all, of the ontico-ontological difference. Ronse, does not the limit of which you are speaking, communicate, in Heidegger, as you sometimes seem to suggest, with a certain phonologism? Derrida, it is not a question of a limit, or, in any event, like every limit it ensures power and grasp, and here it is of an unreplaceable force. But doubtless there is a certain Heideggerian phonologism, a non-critical privilege accorded in his works, as in the West in general, to the voice, to a determined expressive substance. This privilege, whose consequences are considerable and systematic, can be recognized, for example, in the significant prevalence of so many phonic metaphors in a meditation on art which always returns, by means of examples chosen in a very marked way, to art as the appearance of truth. Now, the admirable meditation by means of which Heidegger repeats the origin or essence of truth never puts into question the link to logos and to phone. Thus is explained that according to Heidegger all the arts unfold in the space of the poem which is the essence of art in the space of language and of the word. Architecture and sculpture, he says, occur only in the opening of saying and naming. They are governed and guided by them. Thus is explained the privilege accorded, in a very classical fashion, to poetic speech, Dichtung, and to song, and the disdain for literature. Heidegger says that Dichtung must be liberated from literature, etc. Ronse, this last remark is indicative of the attention you constantly bring to bear on a certain irreducibility of writing or of literary spacing. It is here that your works often seem affiliated with those of the Tel Cure group. 13 Derrida. I can say in any event that what is at stake in the current research of this group, as in any analogous research, seems to me extremely important in 11 ways measured less well in France, it appears, than abroad, and, significantly, less well in the West than in certain Eastern countries. If we had the time, we could analyze the reasons why, and ask ourselves too, why the irreducibility of writing and, let us say, the subversion of logocentrism are announced better than elsewhere, today, in a certain sector and certain determined form of literary practice. But you can very well understand why I would write this word between quotation marks, and what equivocality must be brought into play. This new practice supposes a break with what has tied the history of the literary arts to the history of metaphysics. Ronse, can there be a surpassing of this metaphysics? Can a graphocentrism be opposed to a logocentrism? Can there be an effective transgression of closure, and what then would be the conditions for a transgressive discourse? Derrida, there is not a transgression, if QNE understands by that a pure and simple landing into a beyond of metaphysics, at a point which also would be, let us not I forget, first of all a point of language or writing. Now, even in aggressions or transgressions, we are consorting with a code to which metaphysics is tied irreducibly, such that every transgressive gesture encloses us precisely by giving us a hold on the closure of metaphysics within this closure. But, by means of the work done on one side and the other of the limit, the field inside is modified, and a transgression is produced that consequently is nowhere present as a fait accompli. One is never installed within transgression, one never lives elsewhere. Transgression implies that the limit is always at work. Now, the thought that means nothing, the thought that exceeds meaning and meaning assuring oneself speak by interrogating them, this thought, announced in grammatology, is given precisely as the thought for which there is no sure opposition between outside and inside. At the conclusion of a certain work, even the concepts of excess or of transgression can become suspect. This is why it has never been a question of opposing a graphocentrism to a logocentrism, nor, in genera 1, any center to any other center. Of grammatology is not a defense and illustration of grammatology. And even less a rehabilitation of what has always been called writing. It is not a question of returning to writing its rights, its superiority or its dignity. Plato said of writing that it was an orphan or a bastard, as opposed to speech, the legitimate and high-born son of the father of Logos. 14 At the moment when one attempts to interrogate this family scene, and to investigate all the investments, ethical and otherwise, of this entire history, nothing would be more ridiculously mystifying than such an ethical or axiological reversal, returning a prerogative or some elder's right to writing. I believe that I have explained myself clearly on this subject. Of grammatology is the title of a question about the necessity of a science of writing, about the conditions that would make it possible, about the critical work that would have to open its field and resolve the epistemological obstacles, but it is also a question about the limits of this science. And these limits, on which I have insisted no less, are also those of the classical notion of science, whose projects, concepts, and norms are fundamentally and systematically tied to metaphysics. Ronse, it is in this sense that the idea of the end of the book and the beginning of writing that you invoke in of grammatology should be read. It is not a positive or sociological statement. Derrida, perhaps it is that too, very secondarily. A place is made, in that essay, by all rights, for such a positive inquiry into the current upheavals in the forms of communication, the new structures emerging in all the formal practices, and also in the domains of the archive and the treatment of information, that massively and systematically reduce the role of speech, of phonetic writing, and of the book. But one would be mistaken in coming to the conclusion of a death of the book and a birth of writing from that which is entitled The End of the Book and the Beginning of Writing. One page before the chapter which bears this title a distinction is proposed between closure and end. What is held within the demarcated closure may continue indefinitely. If one does not simply read the title, it announces precisely that there is no end of the book and no beginning of writing. The chapter shows just that, writing does not begin. It is even on the basis of writing, if it can be put this way, that one can put into question the search for an archie, an absolute beginning, an origin. Writing can no more begin, therefore, than the book can end. Ronse, this properly infinite movement might be a little bit like the patient metaphor for your work. Derrida, I try to write, in, the space in which is posed the question of speech and meaning. I try to write the question, what is, meaning to say, 15 therefore it is necessary in such a space, and guided by such a question, I that writing literally mean nothing. Not that it is absurd in the way that absurdity has always been in solidarity with metaphysical meaning. It simply tempts itself, tenders itself, attempts to keep itself at the point of the backslash. Exhaustion of meaning 1 for risk meaning nothing is to backslash start to play, and first to enter into the play of difference which prevents any word, any concept, any major in until dissociation from coming to summarize and to govern from the theological presence of a center the movement and textual spacing of differia tilde c dot at whence, for example, the chain of substitutions of tilde h you were speaking a while ago, architrace, archi-writing, reserve, brisor, articulation, supplement, difference, there will be others. Which is not simply a metonymical operation that would one leave intact the conceptual identities, the signified, idealities, that the chain would be happy just to translate, to put in circulation. It is in this sense that I risk meaning nothing that c tilde imply be heard, or that is a simple affair of herein tilde be entangled in hundreds of pages of a backslash writing simultaneously insistent and elliptical, imprint tildeing, as you saw, even its erasures, carrying off each backslash concept into an interminable chain of differences, surrounding or confusing itself with so many precautions, references, notes, citations, collages, supplements this tilde underscore one meaning to say nothing is not, you will agree, the most assured of exercises.